Good evening, morning, afternoon, classmates. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this article that is on motor imagery training, ameliorating motor clumsiness in children. This is a study done by Dr. Peter H. Wilson, Dr. Patrick Thomas, and Dr. Paul Maroof. So just a little bit of an introduction. We'll start with some background on motor clumsiness. It's common in children. We all know children who, can be standing there 1 minute and then the next minute they're on the ground with both their shoes off. This is actually, it's very common in children. But sometimes motor clumsiness is actually bad enough that it interferes with educational achievement or activities of daily life. And in that case, they call it developmental coordination disorder, or DCD, or we often hear it called dyspraxia. And it occurs this severely in about 5 to 6% of children. So traditionally, there are two types of interventional approaches to treating DCD. One is product-oriented, and that's where we focus on the symptomatic presentation and we try to design the interventions according to those areas of weakness. This is what we basically do a lot in conventional PT. And this assumes that the motor impairments are due to some disruption in what we would consider the normal neural processes. The other interventional approach is process oriented, and this is informed by the information processing theory that we've talked about a lot in class, and also the newer neurocognitive models of motor control and learning. And it focuses on treating clumsiness by looking at the underlying control processes of motor coordination problems. And there's been very little success using these process-oriented interventions, specifically because we don't really have a very good study of children's brains and how they process things because they're still developing. So why did the researchers do this study? First of all, they basically saw these studies, these two interventional ways that we were treating DCD, and they proposed a new model that did not separate the motor and cognitive symptoms of DCD. They basically said that the slow and variable motor performance that characterizes DCD actually means that there's some impairment in the processes associated with the forward modeling of efference copy. And this has to do with feedback and like we've seen in the information processing model. So this impairment in these processes leads to an increased reliance on reafferent motor signals instead of efference copy. And this impairment would result in, or this reliance would result in additional time and error in each step that we take or a child takes in volitional motor sequences. So that would present symptoms that would be consistent with DCD. Previous studies on adults and children had found really significant improvement in motor function from training just motor and kinesthetic imagery alone, no other intervention. And so these researchers hypothesized that the application of a motor imagery training program in children with DCD would be just as effective as the conventional approach that we already take in PT. And if that application of those motor imagery training models were effective, they would support the idea that deficits in the internal representation of movement parameters actually explain all these issues with motor coordination problems in most children. And so that would lead to, if this research was this idea was supported in their research, it would show support for their hypothesis, which they called the efference copy deficit hypothesis. And so that's really what they're trying to prove in this study. So there were 3 treatment groups of 18 in the methods of this. They took children with these motor coordination difficulties that had been referred by school specialists for motor coordination problems that were interfering actually with their academic achievement, or ADLs. And they excluded any children who had issues that were already reported of neurologic disease, like head injuries, psychiatric disorders, or even ADD. And then they took all the subjects and they assessed them with the Movement Assessment Battery for Children, the MABC, for a mean total impairment score for each treatment group. The children were then randomly assigned to 3 groups. They had an imagery training group, a traditional perceptual motor training group, and then, of course, the waitlist control group. And they had a blocked randomization procedure that ensured that each group had, equal or similar representation from all the quartiles of impairment scores, and they were of similar ages. The children were all assessed, of course, pre-test and post-test by an independent evaluator who did not know which group they were in. And their average time between pre and post testing was about 4.5 weeks, give or take some days. And then all the children were assessed and trained individually, not in groups. So the intervention done with the imagery group was done in 60-minute sessions once a week for 5 weeks. And they had 3 exercises that they did with them. The first exercises were designed to improve timing and accuracy of visual imagery skills. So it included basically tracking an object in their mind, watching it on a screen, and then tracking it in their mind to predict the location and time of arrival at a specified location of the object. The second exercises were really interesting. They taught relaxation techniques to the children so that they could reduce their muscle tension and increase imagery effectiveness, and also to develop increased kinesthetic awareness. And this included observing and imitating simple arm movements where they both imagined themselves imitating the movements and then they actually did it physically. The third exercises were observation of video audio sequences of children performing some fundamental skills. And so they watched these kids perform all these skills, all, hitting, jumping, running, just a bunch of stuff. And then they imagined themselves doing these sequences. And then were asked to do a physical action replay and actually physically replay these sequences themselves. With the traditional perceptual motor training group, they received training in a combination of gross motor, fine motor, perceptual motor activities tailored to the customized needs of each child. And these included a whole lot of stuff. Anything, if you have experience in physical therapeutic approaches for motor skills with kids, it was everything. They had everything: hip hopping, skipping, jumping, climbing, and marching, all with like hoops and through with ladders and ropes and things like that. Throwing, catching, and striking balls and other objects. They had them on scooter boards, balance beams. They did peg work with them. They even did origami, and they just did so many things with them. All of this training was in line with what we would consider conventional physical therapeutic approaches. And they had the same duration, same setup for training sessions, 60-minute sessions once a week for 5 weeks. So with the waitlist control group, no treatment was given for 5 weeks. And the contact that they had with them was only for assessment at each phase. And then, of course, when the study was completed, they were offered appropriate services. The results, the MAB scores post-training improved for the imagery group and the perceptual motor training group. And the improvements were similar in magnitude, but there was negligible improvement in the control group. There was one outlier that improved a whole lot in the perceptual motor group. You can see it way up there at the top. They threw that one that was the outlier that they did not really consider in the eventual results analysis, simply because there's always an outlier or two. But the children, the most interesting results, I think, were that the children who started out the most impaired showed the greatest improvement with the motor imagery training. And so these results showed support for the researchers' hypothesis, the efference copy deficit hypothesis, that it's extremely important for your internal referencing before, with motor coordination. What I really enjoyed about the article was that they had very, very thorough controls for bias and other mitigating factors. And the whole idea of internal representation of movement was very important to me. Some weak points were that the sample size was small, the duration was short, and they definitely need to do some more necessary research to further their theory. And I thought it was relevant because I have children and I work with a lot of children. And sometimes in regular PT approach, you feel like you get to the end, like they're as good as it's going to get. But this process-oriented methodology actually offers hope that there is a further therapeutic approach that we can take to advance their treatment. All right, thank you very much. That's the end, and have a great summer.